We're in Colossians chapter 3 this morning, and we've been in this series called Free to Be, looking at the ways the gospel frees us from various things that imprison us and seeing how gospel transformation takes place. Last week we ended in chapter 2, and we see a bit of a transition that takes place today. And I want to begin just simply by reading to reorient us and remind us of where we are in this letter from the Apostle Paul to the church at Colossae. Colossians chapter 3, verse 1 is where we're going to start today. It says this: "If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory." Would you pray with me? Lord, this morning I pray that these words would sink into our heart and that the transformation that was intended for the church at Colossae would be the transformation that we experience from hearing these words spoken from you to us today. We pray this in your name. Amen. So lately there's been kind of a systemic problem that I've been aware of, something that is a bit of an epidemic, and it is not Ebola, for those of you that were worried. The epidemic that I've been very aware of, I've been reading articles about it. There are videos posted on YouTube about it. It's constantly coming up in conversation and dialogue with people. It's pervasive. It's everywhere. It's impacting families. It's impacting relationships. It's impacting groups of friends. And it's something that undoubtedly, if you happen to live in this century, you probably already are experiencing this. And this is this epidemic problem. This is what it looks like. It looks like this. How many of you have experienced this at any time? Yeah. How many of you have been the person with the phone in your hand? Yeah. How many of you have been the person without the phone in your hand, right? We've all been on both sides of this moment, haven't we? It's fascinating when I look at this. This is so much becoming a part of our cultural experience. When I am out eating in a restaurant or I'm out with friends, it's remarkable to me how many people can be on their phones and totally disconnected from the people around them. Usually it happens really simply. It's kind of a natural thing that takes place. The way it happens, like when I'm with people, is that usually there's a conversation that leads to somebody saying, well, I can look that up, right? Like that's where it goes. It's like somebody says something, and it's either like with guys, it's usually, I'll prove you wrong. With my wife, it's like, well, what time does the movie start? You know, there's always these little moments where you go, I can look that up. And so I'll pull my phone out, or whoever will pull their phone out, and there's this remarkable thing that takes place the moment a person's phone is in front of them. Everybody else around the table has this sudden internal urge to see their phone, right? Like they pull their phone out and they look at it and they start doing stuff, and as you're watching them, there's like, you start salivating. You're like, where's my phone? Where's my phone? And then if they're looking and they're kind of scrambling and looking for Wi-Fi, pretty soon you're like, well, I'm just going to see what the time is, right? So you pull your phone out and you check the time, and then you see that so-and-so liked your picture on Instagram. And you're like, who is that? Do I have a stalker? It's like that's the first thing you do when somebody likes your picture on Instagram. Some of you are like, I have a stalker? Like, you get excited about that, you know? Somebody followed me? But like if it's me, I look and I go, yeah, I don't know who that person is. So I'll slide it open, I'll kind of look at their pictures, and then pretty soon, like 4 hours later, I wake up out of the phone coma, and it looks like this, right? And there's one person, and usually it's my youngest daughter in my family because she's the only one that doesn't have a phone. And so she's just sitting there staring at us all like, really, people? Like, this is family time, Which is even more embarrassing because I'll walk into restaurants and you do this. Like I shun the people that are doing this, And this has happened to me recently where I walked into a restaurant and there was a family and they were sitting in a booth and they all had their phones out and I was like, shame on you people. 20 minutes later, I look up from my phone and we're all doing the exact same thing. I'm like, no, like phone's in the middle of the table. Anyone done that? You put everyone's phones in the middle of the table? There's a good little tip for you. Yeah, we'll make everybody just pile them up. Nobody's looking at their phones. Let's just talk. Let's be present with each other. There's this thing, and this is what's ironic about this. I'm not here to preach about the dangers of mobile technology today, just for those of you that might be nervous. The reality is that this is an interesting irony that's taken place. Because these phones that we carry with us everywhere, It's this remarkable invention that was created in order for us to be present with people that weren't physically in front of us. And that was an amazing thing when it was first invented, was it not? I mean, suddenly there's a relative who's halfway around the country or on the other side of the world, and you can pick up the phone and you can hear their voice. And back in the days of AT&T, you could hear the pin drop, right? And it was as if you were in the room with them, and you could experience the relationship. You could be present with them. So I find it incredibly ironic that this invention that was initially created for us to experience the presence of another person who wasn't physically with us can actually remove us from the presence of a person who's physically in front of us. There's an irony in that, is there not? What's even more interesting about this is this has become more pervasive in our culture. It doesn't change the reality that inside of our hearts, we all know there's something wrong with this, don't we? Like you see it and you go, oh man, I wish they wouldn't do that. And then you do it. Why? There's something inside of us that desires to be fully present with people. There's something inside of us that says, when I'm in a conversation with somebody, I want to be fully engaged. I mean, there's times we walk away, and I do this. I walk away from a dialogue, and I think, I don't think I paid enough attention to what was going on, and I really wish I'd have been more present in that moment. There's sometimes with my kids when I kind of skim through parts of my day when I could have just stopped and paused and been present with them. This idea of presence, it's something that we want to be for other people. We also love it when other people are present with us, don't we? Like you love it when you're having a conversation and somebody actually looks at you, right? Instead of their phone or over your shoulder, or they keep looking up. You ever do that? You talk with somebody, it seems like every time you start to get serious, they look away, and you're like, what is it? What is going on, Because we want presence. We want to be present. We desire it. There's this ironic dynamic to being people of faith. And there's even a tension that I think gets created and exists when we read passages like the one in Colossians that I read a moment ago. There's a tension that can suddenly happen that impacts our ability to be fully present. And I think that if you're like me, there are probably moments when you wrestle with how to be fully present in this world and yet fully spiritually alive. When I hear these verses, and I'll read them again for you, there's something that happens inside of my head that creates this sort of awkwardness. Like, how do I live this out? Paul's writing and he says, if then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. I mean, there's this distance. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth, for you've died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Now, there's a part of this I read and I think, well, this is beautiful and this is amazing and I love this, but there's also this tension. Like, what if by living this out, I mean, if I really take this seriously, I mean, there's a part of it on face value. If I'm seeking the things above and I'm setting my mind on things above, and it's all about these spiritual realities, there's a part of this that internally inside of me starts to wrestle with, well, then what do I do with this world? What do I do with this life? Like, how in the world am I supposed to be this person who's spiritually tuned and, thriving as a spiritual being, and then also try to live out in this very physical world that I'm living in? I mean, how do I be the most present person I can be if I'm focused on all of these above sort of things? This is a real tension. It's a tension because no matter who you are, tomorrow we got to wake up and you got to put clothes on. And so the question is, well, how much do I care about what I look like? And when do I cross the line? When do I nudge so close to caring that all of a sudden I'm setting my mind on things on earth? Because that's the kind of stuff, if you read this, you go, yeah, am I getting distracted by this? I'm a car guy. I love cars. Some of you know I've owned 38 cars in my life. That's a lot of cars. I love Craigslist. It's filled with lots of cars. And sometimes I wonder, I wrestle, like how much is too much? How much, I know it's transportation, how much am I allowed to enjoy these automobiles that I drive? And at what point am I setting my mind, seeking these things? How do I live in a world where I still need to get around in a car, and I still need to put clothes on, and I still need to put food on a table, and there still needs to be shelter over my kids? Like, how do I balance that tension? Anybody else wrestle with this sort of thing? Like as a Christ follower, you go, man, how do you really get serious about your spirituality and live in this present world? And at face value, you read these verses, and the assumption would be, well, you just become this sort of spiritual person who's drifting out there, and you let the rest of it just fall into place. You just think about these things, and then life will just kind of come together. Sounds like Woodstock a little bit to me, to be honest, right? But what's fascinating is, as much as you might think that obedience to these verses would result in a sort of lack of presence, a disconnection with culture, when you realize what Paul was saying to these people and what he's really talking about, what you recognize is the opposite is actually true. What he is presenting to us is an opportunity to be more present than we ever imagined we could be, to be the most present, unbelievably present individuals in any given situation. If you remember, if you were here last week, we talked about this dynamic, that one of the significant reasons that Paul was writing this letter to the church at Colossae was that there was a group that had risen up within the church that was advocating for something called asceticism. It was the denial of anything that felt, tasted, or was good. It was this idea that the only way for us to be a spiritual being, for us to really connect with God in our faith, was to fully dismiss the physical life that we were living, to live this rejection towards the world that we could touch and taste. Now, it's important for us to acknowledge this, because if Paul is advocating for something other than asceticism, then it means that these verses in Colossians chapter 3 must not be leading to that. In fact, what they're probably leading us toward is back into the context of community and the people that we're living with. So Paul is writing to address this, which means there's no way that he would be advocating for what we might think these verses actually mean. Paul really begins a transition here in the letter. The first two chapters, we're talking about the supremacy of Christ. And then Paul begins to move, and in chapter 3 and chapter 4, this gets intensely practical. Now, what he's about to say has everything to do with, what do you do today? What does this look like now? How do we live our faith out? He spent the first two chapters basically saying, here are the realities that we know to be true. Here is who Christ is. Here's who you were. Here's who you are now. There's this beautiful picture of the supernatural, the cosmic realities of what it looks like for human beings to connect with their Creator. And in chapter 3, verse 1, there is an immediate transition, and it begins with the simple phrase, if then. If then. He's moving the direction. If then. There's a shift in thinking. And the focus is on the now. He's saying, listen, that stuff was all true, and what I'm about to tell you is really true. If then, there's this, let's talk about what we do tomorrow. Let's talk about what Monday looks like. Let's talk about what lunch looks like today at a restaurant or sitting on a table at home. Let's talk about now. This transition begins to take place, and he says, if then you have been raised with Christ. If you have been raised with Christ. And essentially what he's saying is this: if you believe any of this to be true, if all of this stuff that I've talked about, the supremacy of Christ, the reality of who he is, and the fact that you were dead and now you're alive, which, by the way, is a repeating theme throughout the stories of Scripture. We see Jesus repeating this theme. Even in the story of the prodigal son, the father says, here's the son of mine who was dead and now he's alive. He was lost and now he's found. Paul, throughout his letters, is constantly referring to this theme of us being dead and now being alive. There's this idea of deadness and aliveness. And now in this moment, he's saying, listen, if then you were dead and now you're alive, if then these things are true, if that's something that you put your trust in, if you're the kind of person who years ago, at some point in time, or maybe even in the last several months, you came to a point of realizing that your ultimate trust needed to be placed in someone other than you. If there's a line in which you finally stepped over and you said, I'm going to trust Christ with my life. If those things are true, if you have died and have been resurrected with Christ, if these things are true, then there's something that you should pay attention to. I love the fact that he actually includes us with Christ in this. He says, if you have been raised with Christ, are you with Christ? That idea of being with somebody is usually something that helps people form an assumption about our identity, is it not? Like if there's a couple and they've been dating, and you run into one of the people, like, hey, are you still with her? And they say, well, yeah, I'm still with her. Or are you still with him? And she says, yeah, I'm still with him. Then there's an identity thing. I still identify myself with this person. Paul says, if you have been raised with Christ, there's a reference to intimacy, to identity. This is an identity issue. If you have been raised with Christ, he's saying this thing that Christ did, you did with him. There's this story of this dying and this raising, this being dead and now being alive, and this story has become your story. If you have been buried, dead, and now are alive with Christ, that is your identity. If his story is a story that you find your story in, then his story becomes your story. If your identity is that of being raised and resurrected, then that should impact the whole of your life. That's the point of this. You were raised for a reason. So what Paul is saying, he's saying, listen, if you find yourselves believing the gospel and receiving this, if you find yourself trusting Christ, then this narrative of death, burial, and a resurrected life should be the narrative of your life. The storyline of your story should follow that same thing. There was a deadness, and then there was a raising from the dead, and now there's an aliveness that you're living in. There is a resurrection, and that's the story. And our story, what he's saying, should be identified in that. We're living a resurrected sort of life. There's something new about it. People look and go, man, that guy he was dead and now he's alive. He was lost and now he's found. That's what he's identifying with. That's what this is going to be about. If then you have been raised with Christ, if that's who you are, how do you make your story a story of resurrection? How does that take place? And Paul begins with one very simple, very neutral word. He says, seek. Seek. There is a neutrality to the word seek. And the word that Paul chooses to use here is really interesting. Because it has to do with the will of a man or the will of a woman. He's not saying seeking like going and looking for something. The seeking that he's referring to is the direction or the course that we set for our lives. This idea of seeking, it is, what will the pursuit of your being be? What direction will you head? What will you make important? What will you value? Where will your life take you? That's the idea behind seeking. Seek. He starts with this idea of what is it that you're living for? What is it that matters to you? Now, there's an interesting part of this, and this is what's really interesting, and we're going to see this. There's a tense. In the Greek language, there are tenses of words, just like other languages. The tense of the word that he used is called the present imperative. And the idea behind it is this. He doesn't just say seek, but he's saying seek in the present and then continue on seeking. Like seek now and then keep going. There's this continuous, ongoing effort. So what he's telling us and what he's drawing our attention to, what he's going to say we need to do, he's saying, listen, there's something you need to do. If you want to live the resurrected life, there's something you need to do, but you don't just do it now. This isn't just a decision that you make, a prayer that you pray, and then you hope the rest is good. He says there is something that you do now, and then you continue to do. And instead of that being daunting to us, this is what I love. Because some of us might hear that and we go, man, I would really love to just be able to pray and be good. Like, God, here's my prayer. Let's just make my life good. Everything will be all right. There's a part of us that wants to go, man, I got to do more. Like, what do you mean seek and keep on seeking? What's this going to be all about? The other side of that, and this is what I appreciate about this, Paul's writing to a group of people like us. And he's saying, just because you're with Christ doesn't mean that you've got it all together. In fact, what he's saying is it's very possible. It's very possible, and so don't feel guilty. It's very possible for you to have moments in which you need to refocus, moments when you need to redirect, moments when you need to actually put some effort in, and it's okay. So if you find yourself in a stale, dry place, you can realize that isn't something that I messed up 10 years ago. That may be something that just today has to do with the now, the present imperative of what Paul is saying here. And what are we to seek? The direction of your life, the will of your life. Seek the things that are above. So what he's saying in very practical terms is that the course of our life, the direction of our life, the will of a man or a woman is aimed towards those things that are above. And what he's referencing when he says above is fascinating. The word is just simply above, just above what we're presently in. In fact, Paul doesn't use the word heaven here. He's not focusing on some sort of cosmic geography. This isn't some sort of metaphysical statement about there being a there and a here. He literally is using the word on top of. Get your eyes above of the right now. Like you're living this life and you're moving along. And he's saying, take your eyes off of your feet and raise them above. This last week I started running again, and it's been a while since I've run. In fact, a guy after the last service came up and said, hey, you want to go run this week with me? And I said, yeah, the last time I ran was with you. And he goes, ooh, really? I don't know if he's going to call me this week to see if we want to run, but I have this habit, like every year, it's like kind of a hobby, I should say. I love just like packing on 20 or 30 pounds in the winter. And then like working all spring and summer to get it off and then just packing it back on again. It's like this thing I do every year. In fact, last year, shortly after Christmas, the guy that usually sits back there, he's not here right now, he came up to me after the service and he goes, man, are you all right? You look really fat. I was like, thank you for the truth. In love, buddy. Yeah. And so this year I decided maybe I'll do something different. Maybe I won't gain 20 pounds during the winter. I've already started kind of my rhythm moving that direction. So I started running and it hurts. And I remember why I quit running. Running sucks, right? Like, it hurts. So I'm out running this week, and I told myself I'm going to run every single day. You know, I'm going to do this no matter what. You know, even in the rain, which was just stupid. Running is bad enough. Running in the rain is ridiculous, like craziness. But I was out running this week, and I was just in this moment of like, man, this is miserable, this hurts. And I remembered the words of this friend of mine, my friend Mike Riddle. He said to me one day, he goes, you know, they've proven physiologically that something changes in your brain chemistry when you're running. If you lift your eyes from the ground in front of you and you look up at the horizon, like if you just get your head tilted up, they actually have measured, and a person's outlook on their run, how they feel, all these measurable points in the person's experience, they all go up. All the indicators go up. And so I found myself running along this week, and every time I started to drag, every time I started to hurt, I would glance up, and I'd look up, and all of a sudden I was like, man, I feel pretty good, you know? Like, I don't look good, trust me, but I feel good, right? There was this thing that happened. That's the beautiful illustration that Paul is using as he's describing our life. He's saying, with the course of your will, as you're moving along in your life and you're pursuing these things, the direction you'll go, how you'll spend your time and resources and energy, and what you will define as success for yourself, he's saying, when you're seeking those things, lift your eyes up and look up above this present world that you're living in. In other words, the will of your life, the direction, the course of your life should not be defined by the things that are down here, but rather those things that are up there. He's saying, look above. This isn't some sort of disconnection with reality. He just simply says, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. He's not saying, I want you to live in this far-off, hyper-spiritual zone where you're not connected to the people around you. He's saying, listen, as you're grinding out this life on this planet, let Christ define the direction for your life and the moments within your life. Christ, seated at the right hand of God, what's he doing? He's referring us back to Colossians chapter 1. He's saying, remember, Do you remember his supremacy? Do you remember how in control he is? If you recognize those things, then quit letting all of the distractions and the values and the directions of our culture, all the lies of the society that we live in, tell you what your life is supposed to be about. Tell you what that moment with your kids is supposed to be at. Tell you what that sideline talk with a parent is supposed to. Quit letting all of the things around you define you and lift your eyes up above this. Let Christ begin to define your life in the context of your life. Seek the things that are above. He's saying, listen, this is not a geographical issue. This is an issue of allowing your eyes to look up to what is flourishing and bring that into what is fallen in this earth. It's an opportunity to bring the ethos of who God is and what he's doing, this picture of redemption and wholeness, and translate it into this place and into this time. We, as a family, we used to get exchange students. I make it sound like we used to get eggs. Like we used to get eggs. We used to get exchange students. We used to host exchange students. I think that's probably a more appropriate term. We used to get them. They just come on. Get another one. Where'd that one go? I don't know. We just got another one. We used to have these exchange students, and they would come. And our family, we've got some strong personalities in our family. Like we're just not normal. I'll just admit that. Like we have a very vocal family. We definitely have a culture of our family. I have learned from other people that our family sometimes scares other families. But so we have a strong family culture. Like, there's just a way we do things. And you guys know what this is like. When there's a strong family culture, there's like just a way things are done. And so we sit at certain places around the table and we banter a certain sort of way. And there's just a way that things get done. And here's what's fascinating. When these exchange students would come to live in our home, they would bring with them a certain context. They had experiences in their own home. They had experiences with their parents and their family and the way they did things. And I specifically remember the first exchange student we had. Her name was Natalia, and she's still like one of my daughters, just this great kid, loved her to death, and still do. She comes into our house, and she brings with her these things from her culture and from her family. There was an ethos that she lived in, and when that ethos was left behind, she came into our family, and now all of a sudden she would sit at our table, and the conversation would tweak just a little. And there were new sayings that we suddenly had, and there were new jokes that suddenly developed in the midst of our culture, of our family. Suddenly, things began to shift and move, and we saw her influence our family. She brought what was hers into this, and in many cases, it made this even better. That's the picture that Paul's using. He's saying, seek the things above. And in your seeking of those things, you're bringing the ethos of what is flourishing into this fallen world. You have an opportunity every single day and every moment to bring wholeness and healing and goodness and life and grace and peace. You get to do that. You get to bring what you have to the table in another person's home and bring what Christ has brought to you. He says, seek the things above. And then he explains. He goes on, expands on it. The will, this is the direction you say, Lord, this is what I want for my life. Well, how do you do that? And then next he says, set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. There's a distinction that's made here that's really important for us to see. To set your mind literally means to think or to judge, to consider, to give your mind to it, to meditate on it, to think about it. Some of your Bibles, they may say things, if you read the Bible, some Bibles have translated this to set your affections on things above. And that's wrong. This has nothing to do with affections. This isn't about how you feel about things above. This isn't about whether or not you want to or not. Literally, he's saying, if you desire, if there's something inside of you that stirs and you hear about somebody who has the opportunity to bring flourishing into a work environment or to impact positively a relationship or change a community and have a life that makes a difference, if that's something that resonates with you, that's not going to just happen. You don't just go, okay, God, so I'm going to pray that happens, and then we're just going to see how this works out. There's a participation on our part, and that participation is that we seek and we set our mind on the things above. There is a thinking that takes place. There is a consideration that takes place, and it isn't about how we feel. In fact, if it's about how we feel, our feelings and our emotions will lie to us, will they not? The reality is that our thinking actually has a better opportunity to direct our lives in the right direction than our emotions do. In fact, the way that we think, what we think about, how we think, what we consider will define the direction of our life. Think about it for yourself for a moment. Just kind of rest in this for just a moment. Think about something that you just obsessed over. And you thought about it, and you thought about it, and you thought about it, and you thought about it. Don't we wind up going the direction of our mind? Our mind has the ability, like you think your thoughts don't matter? You think you can just let your mind wander and, well, I'm just going to dabble here, dabble there. No, you think about these things. The thoughts, the way that you think is determining the direction of your life. And so if you are attracted to this life of meaning and purpose, if you desire to be this present person who's bringing heaven to earth, then that happens when we begin to think about things above. Our thinking determines our direction. If you want to seek things above, then you have to think about things above. Seek and set your mind on things above, not on things that are on earth. There's this replacement that has to take place. This isn't something that just occurs. You don't just, I'm going to go do this. When you begin to move your mind from the things of this earth, you have to replace it with things above. There's this beautiful quote by Tim Keller in his book, Counterfeit Gods, and he says this. It's a fascinating reality of why it impacts our direction and why we need to set our minds in a particular course. He says this, Jesus must become more beautiful to your imagination, more attractive to your heart than your idol. That is what will replace your counterfeit gods. If you uproot the idol and you fail to plant the love of Christ in its place, the idol will grow back. So the question is, what occupies your mind? What are you thinking about? Over the last couple of months, and it sounds funny, when a pastor says this sort of thing, but I've been in a funk. I've just been in a funk. I've been in a space where it's like, man, I don't know if I've ever been here before. I can get up and preach messages, and I know the Bible, and, my family's kind of in a lot of ways, cruise control. Things are good, right? We're just kind of trucking along, and I found myself over the last couple of months in this place of just spiritual funk, just kind of flat, like the vital signs weren't really high, you know what I'm saying? And I was talking to a friend a couple of weeks ago, and I just said, this isn't like any other season in my life. There have been times when I've been low, and I've been really low, and then Christ is great about coming into those situations and lifting me up. But right now, it's just kind of flat. It's just kind of like, oh. And God shows up every now and then. I'm like, that's cool that you're here. But just on the day-to-day, regular sort of stuff, I just found myself in a place where it was like, I was telling this to my friend, and then I began to realize, I started asking myself some tough questions, like, well, what am I thinking about? Where do I spend my time? Where does my mind go? Where do I meditate? And you know what I realized? So much of this little funk that I've been in, so much of this flat spot that I've been walking through, wasn't something that you would look at my life and say, well, there it is. There's the sin in your life, Brad. No, what you would see is, I was just thinking about that, thinking about this, thinking about cars, thinking about my kids, thinking about, the lawn needing to be mowed or the sprinklers being fixed, just thinking about all this stuff. My mind just wasn't I just wasn't taking the time to think about, to consider, to dwell on, to give energy in my mind to the things that are above. And so my story started to shift from a story of resurrection to a story of flatness. And what's fascinating, if I can be really honest with you, I don't feel like I've been very present. I haven't been present with friends. I haven't been present with my kids. Like there's a part of me that goes, man, it's interesting that the more I was thinking about the stuff of this earth, the less present I was with the people around me. And so Paul says, man, is this attractive to you? Do you love this? Do you want to see your life lived in the direction of what God desires? Then set your mind on things above. And in verse 3, he kind of moves this transition into this beautiful statement about the gospel. And he just reminds us again, for you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, that is where you will find life. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will appear with him in glory. He brings us back to the gospel because when we understand the gospel, when we understand what Jesus has done for us, it makes us the most secure, insecure people ever, doesn't it? When you understand the love of God, suddenly there is a security that you have that nobody can take away from you. When you realize the story of the gospel is about death being defeated, you realize you're not going to lose even to death itself. When suddenly you don't find your value and your worth in your achievements or accomplishments or titles or the notoriety or words of friends, when those things begin to happen in you, you become a supremely secure and supremely humble person, and that releases you to be in the moment and present with everyone around you. And there is something beautiful that people see when they see a gospel-confident person sitting in front of them. Blaise Pascal has this beautiful quote. He says this about the gospel of Jesus Christ. That the gospel, if we could do this with the gospel, it would be a wonderful thing. That the gospel, we could make good men wish it were true and then show that it is. The gospel of Jesus Christ being so powerful in our life that we could make people say, man, this is real. This is life. We're going to close by singing a song together this morning. So I'll invite you to stand with me. We're going to worship. But this particular song, we're singing for a very specific reason. Because the only way that we ever fully experience the gospel, the only way that we ever truly become present with people is if we surrender to Christ and we allow him to rule in our lives. The only way we ever surrender to somebody is if we understand them to be supreme over us, smarter than us, bigger than us, more powerful than us. It's easy to surrender to somebody who's bigger, stronger, and more powerful, which is why Paul spends so much time leading us to this place of saying, do you want to live this life? If you do, then surrender. And who do you surrender to? You surrender to this one who he has proven to be supreme and above all. And so we're going to sing a song of surrender, a song of relinquishing our will to say, Lord, you lead and you rule in my life. The church at Colossae became a subversive movement that created a radical new culture in the world because they surrendered. And as we surrender our lives, everything from our marriages to our relationships with parents and kids, as we surrender our work environments, as we surrender our resources, whatever it is, we surrender, we begin to see God move and shape in our culture. And so may you be men and women who are fully surrendered to the supreme, the only one, Jesus Christ. May your life be a conduit of his love and grace. And may you bring flourishing to every environment, every situation you find yourself in. May you be the most present, most confident, gospel-secure person to ever walk the face of the planet. Amen. Amen.